people are being urged to go forward in the national interest?
Well, I think there's a difference between constructive opposition and opposition for opposition's sake, and this is absolutely about being constructive, and that's why we've said to government, do things like the 24-hour test guarantee, and get this app up and running, work with local authorities so that they have the data from the testing, which still is not in place, and the government say it won't be in place until the end of June. That is a big mistake, because it is very difficult for directors of public health at a local level, local councils and communities to understand the spread of this virus at the local level and put measures in place to mitigate it themselves if government aren't sharing data.
Rachel Reeves, thank you for talking to us.
It's 17 minutes past 7. We'll be hearing from the Government Health Minister, Edward Argar, after 8 o'clock. Now, later today, we're going to hear the details of the quarantine system for travellers arriving in the UK. What might they do for the travel industry? Here's Dominic with more.
It's been widely reported that nearly everyone coming to the UK will have to self-isolate for a fortnight. The big exemption will be for those coming from the common travel area, which includes, of course, Ireland. Airlines, tour operators, travel agents are most unhappy about this, to say the least. Marcus Eklund is the Chief Executive of FCM Travel Solutions, which focuses on business travel. Mr. Eklund, good morning. Lots of airlines and holiday companies have said they'll have to let staff go if the quarantine goes ahead. Does that apply to you as well?
Good morning, Dominic. Yeah, it definitely would apply to ourselves as well. The quarantine measures which is currently put in place obviously have an enormous impact on the hospitality sector and all the travel industry players here as well. So it would definitely apply to ourselves as well.
What are your clients telling you? Are they just saying they're not doing any business travel at all at the moment?
At the moment, it's extremely limited, but we've recently done a survey at FCM where we surveyed 1,600 of our global corporate customers, and 70% of those customers really want to go back to business travel. They need to travel for their company's sake to get their business going for it. So a lot of this is depending on the government restrictions, not only the UK regulations, but obviously other countries as well. But it's definitely a need for businesses to start traveling again and get back to actually doing business.
In that case, I suppose these plans for air bridges, individual deals with individual countries, and we've heard this morning from a Portuguese minister talking about their desire for an air bridge accommodation with the UK. In that sense, those deals would be of very limited use to you, I guess.
It would be limited, but it also allows people to start traveling and start to do business certain aspects of their industries. So if you look at the European Union and trade that UK is doing with that, just having some air bridges into the European Union or to some selected countries will allow the people to start planning again for their business needs and also be able to start traveling again. So while it's not going to save the industry per se, it will allow corporations to start doing business again and therefore fuel the economy back again for this. So any little help we can be done will be fully appreciated by the industry.
We had Michael O'Leary, the Chief Executive of Ryanair, on the programme recently, where he said he thought that people would just travel anyway, sort of betting on the fact that any quarantine, self-isolation would be completely unenforceable. There just aren't the numbers of people to chase it up. Do you think people might just take a risk and travel anyway?
I think from a personal perspective, some people may do that. I don't think it's going to be to the extent that Mr. O'Leary put forward for it. However, from a business travel community, which is actually the largest travel part we have here in the UK, those obviously more governed by HR departments, governed by the corporation's regulations for it. And they were very unlikely to start traveling because not an individual's decision, it's a company decision for it. So that sector within business travel is going to be severely impacted unless some of these restrictions are eased, or at least we get clarity on when these restrictions will ease.
Thank you very much. Marcus Eklund from FCM Travel Solutions.
The time now is 7:20. Black Lives Matter, the Health Secretary declared yesterday as he published a Public Health England review that found Black, Asian and ethnic minority people are at a significantly higher risk of dying from COVID-19. But the British Medical Association said the review was a missed opportunity, which took the UK no closer to addressing the underlying problems. Well, we can talk to Dr. Chand Nagpal, who's BMA Council Chair. Good morning.
Good morning.
Why a missed opportunity?
Well, we called for this review on the 8th of April, actually, nearly 2 months ago, when it transpired that we were seeing far higher numbers of BAME people in intensive care units, about a third of beds occupied by BAME patients, but also staggeringly, the first 10 doctors who had died from COVID were all from a BAME background. And what we were looking for, what we called for, and what we thought the review would do is give us some understanding as to the reasons why we were seeing this, but secondly, to put in place mitigations to protect the BAME community. Now, this review, I don't know if you've actually looked at it, it's just full of graphs and figures. It's a statistical analysis. It isn't a report or a review which has come up with any actions, any recommendations, and therefore it hasn't taken us further.
Public Health England were asked about this. Well, Professor John Newton from the organisation was asked about this yesterday at the press conference, and he urged people not to jump to conclusions. He said what the report was for was going to go out to people around the country, and then they could base their own recommendations on that research.
I think we must remember this is a situation where as the Health Secretary said, and with global awareness of inequalities, Black Lives Matter, and we have a situation where sectors of our community and professionals and healthcare workers are dying at a far higher rate. So if we are to save lives, if we are to protect people, we don't have the luxury of going out and discussing how to implement this report. What we need are some clear recommendations and actions and mitigations now, which really could be taking place.
But is it as clear as that? Because again, what Professor Newton said, that he said it's not necessarily because of people's ethnicity, it may be related to their occupation or other reasons why they might be at higher levels of exposure.
So what this report shows, that in fact ethnicity in its own right seems to be an independent risk factor to the impact of this disease, and there are of course additive factors that affect the BAME community. So for example, the report shows very clearly, we knew it before, that key workers who have been working throughout the lockdown and now will continue to be working, who are not able to socially distance, people like transport workers, shop assistants, security guards, taxi drivers, and it's been very clear that these put you at risk, and we know that a larger proportion of key workers come from a BAME background. So even having a recommendation to make sure that there are workplace adjustments so that they aren't exposed when they can't socially distance would have been an important recommendation. In terms of healthcare workers, the report hasn't even looked at it, even though more than 90% of doctors who have died have come from a BAME background. And representing doctors myself, we believe this really should have been one of the components of this report so that we could put in place mitigations.
The study also said that some of the issues due to underlying health issues, so people of Bangladeshi and Pakistani background having higher rates of cardiovascular disease, Black Caribbean, Black African people also having higher rates of blood pressure.
Yes, so we know that additional underlying conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease add to the risks of COVID-19 impacting seriously on your health. And the ethnicity section in this review didn't include those factors in assessing why BAME members of the population were dying at a higher rate. But the other thing it found, and it hasn't been publicised, is the report also showed that in all-cause mortality, so the deaths from non-COVID causes, was also higher in several BAME communities. So the inequalities during this pandemic have applied not just to COVID, but also to those other conditions. And if you know, and we know that people have not been attending hospital at the same rates for heart attacks and strokes. So there has been a wider impact. But what has not been done is try to understand the specific reasons that especially some of the structural factors in the workplace that may have contributed to these disparities.
Dr. Chan Nagpal, Council Chair of the British Medical Association, thank you for talking to us.
It's 26 minutes past 7, time for the sports news. News of the cricket. Here's Carthy.
Indeed. Hopefully we will have international cricket this summer. 3 tests between England and West Indies will be played in 3 weeks at the start of July at the GS Bowl and Emirates Old Trafford, and they're still subject to government approval. We can speak to the England and Wales Cricket Board Head of Special Projects, Steve Elworthy. A very special project, this one. Locations have been chosen because they have hotels on site, and hopefully West Indies arrive on June 9th. Presumably even getting them through an airport safely is difficult. What was the biggest challenge to get confirmation of this, Steve?
Hi, good morning, Kathy. Yeah, listen, I think it being the first international match that's going to be hosted is probably one of the biggest challenges that we faced. I think there are a number of areas that you look at when you put a project like this together, and I think that the multiple stakeholders that we're dealing with across, be that from a team's perspective, the government, the venues, there's just so many different stakeholders that we need to make sure they're absolutely comfortable with our plans. The science and medicine asks have been changing, but have been strengthened as we speak every day, and we work very closely with them. So I think really from a green light point of view, there are a number, but probably it's incredibly positive, the support we've had from government and also from the West Indies team themselves.
You mentioned the West Indies team there. We know that Formula One had an exemption of quarantining for just 7 days. I know cricket didn't ask for that, but West Indies has had fewer than 100 deaths. How much has the difference in the levels of coronavirus been an issue for them?
Well, it's certainly something that we've been in dialogue with them for a number of months, as you would imagine now, and I think we've got to a point where we spent a number of meetings and hours with them online, discussing with them our plans and our proposals, and getting them comfortable with the fact that we are putting in place an environment where they're going to be as safe and secure as possible. And I think that was one of the key elements to this. To the point where we're expecting an announcement today of the West Indies squad. So, we've still got more conversations to have with them over the course of the next couple of days. And I think they really are, I think that we're pretty positive and excited about this now. You think we're going to have a team of highly competitive sportsmen fly into Manchester and then move into Old Trafford, who are going to have the run of a fantastic cricket venue to be able to train and play while they're in quarantine.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. The ECB had mentioned they were looking at a £380 million black hole in their finances due to coronavirus. How much of that hole does this help fill? And does women's cricket come into maybe helping out with that?
Yeah, listen, I think there's no escape, Carty, that there is going to be a significant dent in the finances, but I think it's far too early to say what that number would be. We've still got a season to get through, and certainly those will be discussions that will be ongoing with the ECB. But your point about the women's series is absolutely spot on. We've been in discussion with India and with South Africa about a possible tri-series at the back end of the summer. So it's certainly something that we don't want to lose the impetus behind women's cricket and women's sport. So certainly something that's on the radar for us now, and working very closely to try and get that across the line.
OK, Steve Elworthy, thank you very much for your time this morning. Just to mention that the 2020 Formula One season will get underway on July 5th with 2 races at Silverstone for the first time in August. And Rugby Union's Premiership and Championship clubs have been told they can resume training. We'll discuss that in the next hour. This morning's racing tips: Kempton 2:45, number 5 Hypothetical, Yarmouth 4:50, number 4 Kesarina.
Carty, thank you. Now, this Thursday, it's your turn to choose your Desert Island Discs.
The songs that move people.
I know. I'm going to play some music at 1 o'clock and see what happens. Play it out my window.
That have brought light in the dark.
That's the tune I play every day and have done since 2 days into lockdown. A week or so later, I had a complaint from somebody in the village, and I thought, hello, here we go. And they said, we can't hear it.
Lauren Laverne presents Your Desert Island Discs on BBC Radio 4 this Friday morning at 9.
Now, if it felt like a desert island and all that sunshine, I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring you news of the weather. Cloudy for many, with spells of rain. Good for your garden, of course. Heavy at times, feeling cooler and breezier.
You're listening to Today on Radio 4 with Nick Robinson and Martha Carney. It's 29 minutes to 8. Here's a summary of the news from Chris Aldridge.
Tens of thousands of demonstrators have taken to the streets of America for an 8th night to protest against the death of George Floyd, the black man who died while being restrained by police last week. Members of Mr. Floyd's family joined a 60,000-strong crowd in his hometown of Houston in Texas to honour his memory. The demonstrations were largely peaceful, although some protesters defied city curfews aimed at preventing another night of unrest. About 1,600 U.S. Army troops have been deployed in bases around the Washington area. Sir Keir Starmer has warned that Boris Johnson's mismanagement of the coronavirus pandemic could result in a second wave of infections. In The Guardian, the Labour leader accuses the Prime Minister of winging it over the lifting of lockdown restrictions, describing the move as an exit without a strategy. Number 10 said it was proceeding with caution to secure a safe recovery. Portugal's foreign minister says his government is talking to Home Office officials about a so-called air bridge agreement. He said Portugal was open to receiving British tourists this summer and wanted them to avoid quarantine restrictions on their return. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, is expected to tell MPs today that new quarantine rules are needed to help control the virus. Italy is relaxing its lockdown restrictions further today by allowing people to travel freely within the country and to and from other European countries. The move is an attempt to salvage the country's summer tourism season, which employs around 4 million people. The Japanese car manufacturer Nissan says its plant in Sunderland won't be sustainable if the UK fails to agree a trade deal with the European Union. The factory employs 6,000 people. Boris Johnson has said Britain will change its immigration rules and offer millions of people in Hong Kong a route to citizenship if China imposes new security laws. Writing in The Times, the Prime Minister said the UK would have no choice but to uphold its ties with the territory. Britain's beekeepers are asking people to report any sightings of Asian hornets, which can kill bees and have been advancing across Europe. The hornets are an inch long and have distinctive bright yellow tips to their legs.
The time now is 27 minutes to 8. University leaders have set out how they might bring students back for the start of the autumn term, with ideas like protective bubbles to keep course mates in small groups. Campuses have been closed since the start of the lockdown, and a lot of teaching has moved online. But Universities UK has published guidelines on what university life could look like in the future. Our correspondent Dan Johnson reports from Loughborough.
I'm Caitlin, I'm studying biology, English and history, and I'm hoping to study English at Bristol University.
I'm Ryan, I studied A-levels in maths, chemistry and biology, and I'm hoping to go to Leicester to study physiotherapy.
I'm Molly, I do business, geography and maths, and I'm hoping to study business management at York University.
Ambitions, plans, hopes and dreams, all disorientated by coronavirus. So at Sharnwood College in Loughborough, these A-level students are trying to work out what university life will be like.
I am also nervous about the idea of losing out on the student experience a bit, because I feel like that is a big part of university. You do pay a lot of money to be there, you put in a lot of debt afterwards, and, well, the idea of going through all of that and not quite getting what you hoped for is a bit disappointing.
I did consider deferring, but for me I feel like I need to have things in place for that gap year if I wanted to go ahead with it.
If I'm not going to go to the university, is it what I really want? Because if I'm still, most of the point was that I wanted to get away from home. But if I'm not going to get away from home, is there any point of paying all that money?
So, across the road at Loughborough University,
welcome to our brand new 1.6 million unused 580-seater lecture theatre.
Wow. Health and Safety Manager Neil Budworth is showing me the future. Or is it the past?
We could probably get 50 or 60 in. The challenge is obviously making sure we get people through the door and staggering arrivals. Once we've got people in, they can spread out. But getting them in, going to those areas with limited capacity, that's the challenging bit.
Student bubbles are being considered, living and studying in the same small groups, with a reshuffled timetable to stagger lessons and practical classes bunched together.
You know, we've got to make sure the campus is safe and secure.
It's a lot to balance for Chief Operating Officer Richard Taylor, who knows student life must be enjoyable too.
They're going to want to socialise, they're going to want a campus university experience, and it's our job to facilitate that in a safe and secure way for them. OK, we might not have some of the big nightclubs running and so on and so forth, but that social experience, that building friendships will be there.
So arrival at all our campuses, the students go through the airport-style scanner.
At the University of Bolton, temperature scanners, masks and gloves are a stark attempt to keep numbers up on campus.
If there's a problem with that, then obviously they'll be invited not to join the campus at that moment and have their health checked.
Vice-Chancellor George Holmes spoke to the BBC from behind a visor.
Students pay for going to university and attending, and we're going to provide them with that experience. And yeah, we were said to be out of step at the beginning of the sector, but there's a number now following us in the sector. Student experience is number one for us, and this is going to be the best student experience in a COVID-secure environment.
Others are focused on new ways of teaching. Julia Buckingham is Vice-Chancellor at Brunel and speaks on behalf of all British universities.
There are some wonderful examples of digital education now, really exciting. Techniques like virtual reality. So I do see this as a really exciting opportunity. If I'm honest, it's something I've been wanting to do for a long time. And I think our students actually will embrace it.
Will it be effective? Will it be fun? There's lots of detail to add, and the university's challenge is to convince students socially distanced learning will be worthwhile.
Dan Johnson reporting. Well, we can hear now from Sir David Bell, Vice-Chancellor and Chief Executive of the University of Sunderland. Good morning.
Good morning.
Student experience just isn't going to be the same, is it?
Well, I think it's going to be different, certainly in the early months, if the current guidelines still pertain. But we know from our application numbers and from the continuing interest being shown in university by students that I think they still want to come and undertake their higher education with us.
You say different. A lot of students might say worse, and why should they be paying the same level of fees when they're not going to be enjoying the same kind of experience as their predecessors have?
Well, clearly that's a decision that individual students will take, but I think it is still the case that across universities there is a lot of interest still amongst prospective students. We are open for business in the autumn. That's a clear and consistent message from universities. We believe that face-to-face engagement is central to learning and teaching, but of course we're also going to be balancing that up with the use of online activities as well.
But if students aren't getting full face-to-face teaching, should they be having to pay the full amount of fees?
Well, it's been made clear, I think, by both the government and the regulator that we need to be clear about the experience as best as we can that students will receive in the autumn, and we're all trying to do that at the moment. But I think it's also true to say that you can still have a rich and engaged student experience and academic experience coming to university, even though that we're going to be operating under slightly different circumstances to those that have gone by. So I think it is still very good value and a great choice for students to choose to come to university.
And in terms of how safe they're going to be, do you support this idea of protective bubbles?
Well, the idea of protective bubbles might work in certain circumstances, but many universities, our own included, have a very high percentage of commuter students, in other words, students who live at home and travel into university on a day-to-day basis. So that, in that sense, the protective bubble may not work. However, there can also be a whole range of other measures and mechanisms in place to keep students safe. And I know that every university across the country will do all in its power to keep its students safe, even though we might do it slightly differently place to place.
Sir David Bell from the University of Sunderland, thank you.
The time now is 20 to 8, and it's time to look at today's newspapers and news websites. And the Home Secretary Priti Patel and the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps have put their names to an article in The Telegraph making the case for the government's much criticised quarantine policy. These measures are informed by the science, backed by the public, and are essential to protect public health, they write.
The joint article is intended as a show of unity, the Telegraph says, but it also reports that many Conservatives want so-called travel corridors to be rapidly established to get round the restrictions. The Telegraph says that Home Office sources were keen to stress last night such corridors might not be possible by the end of this month, a position the paper says may spark a Tory rebellion.
HuffPost UK picks up on comments from the government's testing czar, Professor John Newton, that test and trace could potentially replace quarantine for holidaymakers. The Star is also encouraged that overseas trips could soon be back on. Don't forget your toothbrush is its front page headline, below an image of a suitcase adorned with the names of alluring destinations, including Mallorca, New York and Barnard Castle.
Save our summer holidays is the headline come demand on the front of the Daily Mail. It reports that Boris Johnson has told ministers to keep alive hopes of breaks abroad amid a backlash over his quarantine plan. A Downing Street source tells the paper, "We'll be guided by the science," before adding, "but the PM doesn't want to be standing in the way of people's holidays unnecessarily."
According to The Guardian, many people have been facing much more pressing needs, with UK food bank charities having their busiest month ever at the start of the lockdown. The Trussell Trust says demand went up 89%, while for the Independent Food Aid Network said the increase was 175%. They're appealing for an emergency cash support scheme to help struggling households. A government spokesman tells the paper ministers have taken significant action to support those affected by coronavirus.
The Telegraph suggests the pressures of the crisis appear to be straining marriages, with one legal advice firm reporting a 40% increase in divorce inquiries. Concerns about finances, employment, as well as having to spend an increased amount of time together can add strain on relationships, a family law expert explains.
All of which might leave some people wanting to reach for a drink, in which case the Sun might have some welcome news. The paper says it's been privy to a secret blueprint to unshutter the nation's boozers, drawn up by the Department for Business. It could see pubs fully reopen by the end of June, the paper says, albeit with orders placed remotely via a phone app. One landlord, Greg Grundy of the Egremont in Worthing, says there's definitely demand from customers. He tells the papers it'll be a scramble for stock. There's an unquenchable thirst for pub beer out there.
Sure there is. The time now is 17 minutes to 8.
Remember Jeremy, the lefty? No, not that one. The snail who was reverse coiled, making him, wait for it, something of a celebrity. Jeremy the snail first made his broadcasting debut on this programme when scientists made a global appeal to find a lefty mate to study why his coil went the opposite way round to millions of other familiar snails. And they think they now have the answer. Dr. Angus Davison, evolutionary geneticist at the University of Nottingham, joins us on the line. Morning to you.
Good morning, Nick.
Let's come to the good news. We should start with the sad news. Jeremy no longer with us.
Yes, Jeremy died more than 3 years ago now, so I have been working on trying to understand what made Jeremy different for those 3 years, breeding
and
in the end 15,000
you're getting
snails. There. Yes. Well, the irony is, as a geneticist, I set out to try and understand what it was about Jeremy's genetics that made Jeremy the snail a left coiling rather than right coiling. And the irony is, actually, it turned out that it wasn't genetics at all. We think it was most likely a developmental accident. So something that happened during the very early development of the snail that made it coil one way or the other.
In crude terms, do you mean that because you were able to breed lots of lefty snails together and not get lefties as a result, that made you think, well, there we are, it's not genetics?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So we bred the offspring of Jeremy, we bred the offspring of Jeremy, the grand offspring of Jeremy, the great-grand offspring of Jeremy, and in fact none of them turned out to be left coiling like Jeremy. So I mean, you could put that as we tried to understand what made Jeremy different. In the end, we couldn't. Jeremy was special in that sense.
Now, you did not do all this fantastic amount of work merely to entertain us on the Today programme. There's a real kind of purpose, which allows you to learn not just about the snail, but apparently about other animals, even ourselves as well.
Yes, that's true. So I mean, the work was absolutely enabled by the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, which I'm really grateful. The real reason we're doing this is to understand body asymmetry. So if you look at ourselves, outwardly we're symmetric, but inwardly we're asymmetric, so nearly everybody will have the heart on the left. And just occasionally people will have the heart on the right. In a sense, just like Jeremy was a rare snail, had a left coiling shell. And, we're beginning to pick apart the really early developmental biology that enables these decisions between left and right to be made in the early embryo. And there is an indication that the same set of genes is involved in setting up the left and right side of a snail's body, as well as the left and right sides of our own body. So, I think if there's a legacy for Jeremy, it's helping people appreciate what it is about our bodies that makes them special and what happens sometimes when things develop in a different way.
But isn't your conclusion then that it's all an accident? It isn't genetic predictability?
Yeah, so in 20 years of working on snails, I've still never found a left-coiling garden snail for myself. I've only found them through other people. So in garden snails, they're very rare, and the conclusion is, yes, it's usually a developmental accident. But actually in other snails, there's a genetic component, a very large genetic component to that. Just as in humans, sometimes when you have a mirror image body, your heart's on the right, there's a large genetic component to that. And as I say, some of the things involved are involved in doing that.
We are delighted we were able to help with that important piece of research. Dr. Angus Davidson, thanks very much indeed.
We're all going to be out staring at snails today, aren't we? The time now is 13 minutes to 8, and that means it's time for Thought for the Day. The speaker this morning is Akindadi Das, a Vaishnav Hindu teacher and theologian.
Good morning. Over the past week, I've been hearing from friends in the US concerned that the protests following the death of George Floyd have taken on a darker mood on account of the unique set of current social circumstances and political interests. No wonder, the worst unrest since the murder of Martin Luther King. King himself referred to public protest as the voice of the unheard, and this Christian leader was inspired by Gandhi's Satyagraha movement, the force of truth. Ahimsa, non-violence, has a long history within Hindu texts. The Atharva Veda defines it as not causing pain to any living being at any time through the actions of one's mind, speech and body. For Gandhi, the principle of absolute non-violence was essential to retain moral authority. He recognized that during protest, the voice of the unheard is vulnerable. It might be drowned out under the tumult of the establishment as it decries the civil disruption and justifies crushing dissent. But it's nigh impossible for the Black Lives Matter cause to curb the criminal actions of a few, or to distance itself from the role played by outside agitators. Looting or damaging property is an act of violence according to the Vedas, but not as bad as using excessive brutality against the perpetrators. Words matter, and many worry that President Trump's threat to deploy the military to quickly solve the problem may fuel further division and aggression. Fortunately, many other voices in the US, including George Floyd's brother, plead for demonstrators and the police to ease the antagonism. Hariharananda, 19th century theologian, extended non-violence to mean never causing fear in another person's mind. Unfortunately, many incidences during these protests do just that, whether it's the hostility of certain police forces or the dangerous destruction by some activists. But others have taken a different approach. In Flint, Michigan, police walked with demonstrators to acknowledge solidarity against the wrongful killing by one of their own. The sage Patanjali asserted that non-violence must be supported by truthfulness. Violence is perpetrated when the truth of an injustice is denied, ignored, or covered up. But perhaps the most difficult truth to face is that racism and inequality remain a structural violence within US society, and indeed within our own. In the words of the Vedic prayer, let us have concord amongst all our communities. May we unite in our purposes and not cause pain to the divine spirit within any of us. Then perhaps, as former President Obama has written, this moment can be a turning point in our long journey to live up to our highest ideals.
That was Thought for the Day with Akindadi Das. The time now is 10 to 8.
Has the lockdown been eased too quickly? The transmission risk from coronavirus is still, thanks to the intervention of the Chief Medical Officer, designated officially as high, level 4. The much vaunted test and trace system for finding and isolating those with or perhaps carrying the disease has yet to be seen to be functioning well. The former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt, who now chairs the Commons Health Select Committee, was one of those leading the calls for that test and trace system to be created, and he joins us on the line now. Morning to you.
Good morning, Nick.
How close are we to getting the sort of test and trace system that you've long been calling for?
Well, I think we are getting there, and I think the most important thing is that we are trying to do what they've done in countries like Taiwan and Korea. This afternoon at the Select Committee, we're going to be talking to the former Vice President of Taiwan, where they've had just 7 deaths in total from coronavirus. And they've done it through test and trace. And of course, we're going to have some teething problems. I mean, this system was set up in less than a month from a standing start. But what we want to understand is, what are the teething problems, and are there any other more structural problems in the approach we've taken, so that we really can make sure we get it absolutely right.
We've yet to get government data on how effective it is, but there was leaked data yesterday that suggested only around 40% of those who test positive for the virus are having their contacts traced. Now, the government says it is a bit higher than that, maybe even a majority. It's still painfully low, though, isn't it?
Well, we're going to be talking to Dido Harding, Baroness Harding, who's in charge of the programme this afternoon, and we'll be asking her for up-to-date data. But my biggest concern at the moment is the time it's taking for tests to be turned around, because the Government Advisory Committee, SAGE, their minutes of the 1st of May, which have now been published, say that to be effective, you have to get people's close contacts to isolate within 48 hours. Now, if the test results themselves take 48 hours to come back, that is going to be impossible. So I strongly welcome the Prime Minister's new 24-hour test turnaround target. But at the moment, the government isn't saying how many tests are being met within that target. And for test and trace, it's absolutely essential that they all are.
What do you make of the fact that the statistics, those that you say that you want to see, have now been criticised by the National Statistics Authority, who suggested they were all about meeting targets and less about giving us any sort of clear understanding of what was actually going on?
Well, I think when we reflect on the bigger lessons for the NHS from coronavirus, we will ask ourselves why it is we seem to have a system that only really reacts when you have a big target, and that encourages the government to do what it can to present statistics in an attractive way. And I don't think that's the only or indeed the best way of making things happen. I mean, what matters for test and trace is that you actually contact 80% or more of someone's close contacts, and you get them to isolate very quickly. So the testing capacity and the number of tests conducted on any one day is part of that picture, but it's not the whole story. And I hope what we get is an end-to-end system. And obviously that's what we'll be asking Baroness Harding about this afternoon.
It is clear from the opinion polls that the Prime Minister needs to restore trust. He needs to regain public confidence in the way the government is handling this crisis. What should he do to do that?
I think the most important thing is to make test and trace work. I mean, one of the most interesting things you just referred to on the programme is Professor John Newton's comment yesterday that test and trace could actually be a replacement for quarantine. If you know that you're going to track down anyone who comes from abroad and isolate them really quickly, then you don't need to have a sort of blanket quarantine measure that stops people going on holiday or doing business trips or whatever. So I think the real answer to this, what people want to see, is a functioning system that works. I think we can absolutely get there. It's been very, very fast, the process of setting it up. Yeah.
Forgive me, you don't only need to test them quickly, to isolate people quickly. You have said on this programme many times, you actually need quite an intrusive system, whereas what the government is saying about their quarantine plan is 1 in 5 people might get a phone call from someone to check that they're still quarantining. That's it. Nothing like we've seen in the East, where the police can be outside your house. You can even have your door taped up.
Yes, I mean, in Taiwan, the police call you twice a day to check that you're still carrying your mobile, and if you don't pick up the phone, someone comes around and visits you, and there are big fines. And that's one of the things we want to understand, is how important compulsion is in this situation. But we are a different society. There was a high degree of compliance with the lockdown measures, much higher than people predicted. So I think people in this country do understand the importance of public health measures, and it may not be necessary to do all that. But, you know, the most important thing is that it happens, that people who have the virus isolate quickly and don't pass it on to others, and that's what this test and trace process needs to do.
Just time for a quick word, wearing your other former hat, former Foreign Secretary, of course. Do you welcome the offer of visa-free travel to the UK, possibly UK passports, for the people of Hong Kong?
Yes, I do. And I was one of the people who actually wanted us to do this before the handover in 1997. But I think what the Prime Minister has announced is incredibly important, not just for the nearly 3 million Hong Kong people who could benefit, not just because it's righting a historic wrong, but also because, you know, the Conservative Party has always listened to people's concerns on immigration. And so it is an incredibly bold move for a Conservative government to make this statement. And it shows Beijing that we are totally and utterly serious in saying that we are expecting them to stick to the obligations of the Joint Declaration in 1984. So I think it's a very, very big moment.
Aren't all the signs that Beijing is not interested in the messages coming from the West, that it is threatening the rights of the people in Hong Kong and continues to threaten Taiwan?
Well, it shouldn't underestimate the resolve of the West, but I think you're right to point to Taiwan as the biggest risk, because one of the reasons that the one country, two systems deal has held for over 20 years is because Beijing wanted to offer that same formula to Taiwan and achieve peaceful reunification. They can't make that offer to the people of Taiwan with any credibility if they're dismantling it in Hong Kong. So I think the biggest worry of all in the current situation is that Beijing might have abandoned the prospect of peaceful reunification and be looking at the military options.
Military options to take Taiwan?
Absolutely. Now, I'm not saying this is likely to happen anytime soon, but let's remember this government in China thinks a very long time ahead. They've made it very clear that they want to reunify with Taiwan by 1949. And only last month, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, for the first time, when he was talking about reunification with Taiwan, dropped the word peaceful. And so I think we have to listen very carefully to what the Chinese leadership is saying.
Jeremy Hunt, thank you very much.
It's 3 minutes to 8, and that means that we can now hear about the weather from Chris Fawkes. Hi there.
Hi Martha, yes, and we're talking about a big drop in temperatures. Yesterday's high of 27 degrees Celsius, in fact widely across the UK we had temperatures into the mid-20s. Well, we're looking at highs of around 10 degrees Celsius lower today, so it's a much cooler day. England and Wales got some rain around as well, the heaviest rain working across northern England and Wales, where we're going to see around 5 to 10 millimetres falling quite widely. Some of the hills, the Pennines of the northeast, could see around 20 or 30 millimetres of rain, so useful rain here, but the rain becomes very light and patchy, pretty sporadic really across the Midlands, central southern England, East Anglia in the southeast, so no huge rainfall amounts expected for these areas, and there will be occasional brighter spells. It is a cooler day, temperatures for most between 14 and 18 degrees Celsius. Northern Ireland, a few showers, but the weather largely becoming dry with some sunny spells this afternoon. Temperatures here around 15 degrees, which again is about 10 degrees lower than yesterday. And finally for Scotland, again a few showers feeding in across southern and eastern areas, but otherwise bright with some sunny spells, the best of it in the northwest, and temperatures between 14 and 17 for most. That's the weather.
Thank you, Chris. Next week, two science sleuths return to Radio 4.
I'm Dr. Hannah Fry.
And I'm Dr. Adam Rutherford.
And we are back here on BBC Radio 4 to investigate more of your everyday mysteries using the power of science.
Including, what is the point of wasps?
Nice sound effect.
Could we make a machine to make it rain?
Great sound effects.
And starting with, why do our tummies rumble?
Terrific sound.
Sorry, that wasn't actually a sound effect. I skipped breakfast.
Oh. The Curious Cases of Rutherford and Fry
starts next Tuesday at 3:30.
And coming up in the next hour of this programme, the government unveils its plans to quarantine those arriving in the UK, arguing that we owe it to the thousands who've died. The poet and novelist Ben Okri on the US protests, and beekeepers beware, a new predator is threatening E. Connolly's The Asian Hornet.